The spy program, so secret that the US denied it existed for 50 years. Imagine this. You work for the United States government. You fly missions over the most hostile territory on Earth. You carry cameras capable of photographing a newspaper headline from 60,000 feet in the air. And if you get shot down, if your plane is destroyed, if you are captured, or if you die, your government will look the world in the eye and say, "We have no idea who you are." That program existed. For 50 years, the United States government denied it, erased it, buried it under layers of classification so deep that the pilots who flew those missions were told never to speak of it. Not to their wives, not to their children, not to anyone. Today, we pull back the curtain on one of the most extraordinary intelligence operations in American history. This is the story of the U-2 spy plane program. To understand why this program existed, you have to understand the world of the 1950s. It is 1953. World War II has been over for less than a decade. Europe is a continent divided. On one side, the democratic West, led by the United States. On the other side, the Soviet Union, a nuclear-armed superpower whose military intentions are almost completely unknown to American intelligence. And that word, unknown, was terrifying. Here is why. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The Americans were stunned. They had believed they had years before the Soviets could match them. They were wrong. And that realization sparked a fear that would define the next 4 decades. The fear that the Soviets were secretly pulling ahead. Were they building more bombers, more missiles? Were there secret military bases hidden deep in the Russian interior? Were they planning a first strike? President Dwight D. Eisenhower needed answers. But there was a problem. You cannot just send a spy into Russia. The Soviet Union was a closed society, sealed off from the outside world, with one of the most sophisticated internal security apparatuses ever constructed. Human intelligence, the old-fashioned spy-on-the-ground approach, was producing almost nothing useful. The United States was, in the words of one CIA officer at the time, flying blind. Eisenhower needed a new idea. And the idea that came back to him was so bold, so technically ambitious, and so legally ambiguous that it should not have worked. But it did. The concept was deceptively simple. Fly over the Soviet Union and photograph everything. Of course, in the 1950s, that was almost impossible. Soviet air defenses were formidable. Their radar could track incoming aircraft. Their fighter jets could intercept. If an American military plane crossed into Soviet airspace, it would be shot down, and that would be an act of war. But what if the plane flew higher than any fighter jet could reach? That was the question posed by a group of scientists and engineers gathered by the CIA in the early 1950s. Their conclusion? Build a plane that could cruise at altitudes above 70,000 feet, nearly 14 miles above the Earth's surface. At that height, Soviet interceptors could not reach it. Their radar might detect it, but they could not touch it. The man tasked with building this aircraft was Clarence Kelly Johnson, one of the greatest aviation engineers in American history. Johnson ran a secret division of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation known as the Skunk Works. It was the same team that would later design the SR-71 Blackbird, still the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built. Johnson was given a nearly impossible set of requirements. Build a plane that could fly higher than 70,000 feet, travel thousands of miles without refueling, carry a high-resolution camera system capable of photographing details as small as a foot across, and do it all in as little time as possible. He did it in 8 months. The aircraft was officially designated the U-2.
Officially, it was registered as a weather research plane. In reality, it was a precision surveillance tool designed to penetrate the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The program was codenamed Aquatone. Later, it would simply be known as the U-2 program. And it was placed under the direct control of the CIA, not the Air Force, not the military, the CIA. That distinction mattered enormously, as we will see. Flying the U-2 was not a job. It was a calling and a sacrifice. The pilots selected for the program were not told much. They were approached quietly, often through their commanding officers, and asked a simple question. Would you be interested in a highly classified assignment with significant risks and significant rewards? Those who said yes were taken through a screening process unlike anything in normal military service. Physical examinations, psychological evaluations, loyalty checks, and then, finally, the briefing.
What they were told was this: you will fly alone at extreme altitude over denied territory. You will not be acknowledged as a government employee. You will carry no military identification. If you are captured, the United States government will deny any knowledge of your mission. And then came the question that many of them would carry for the rest of their lives. Do you still want to do this? Most of them said yes. Flying the U-2 itself was an extraordinary physical challenge. The aircraft had an operational ceiling so high that pilots had to wear full pressure suits, essentially early versions of spacesuits, to survive at that altitude. The cockpit was the size of a coffin. Missions lasted 8 to 10 hours, flying in complete silence, often without radio contact, navigating by stars and dead reckoning over featureless Soviet terrain. The margins for error were almost non-existent. Fly too fast, and the wings would fail. Fly too slow, and the engine would flame out. At 70,000 feet, both of those scenarios meant one thing: death. These men flew in secret. They were paid well. They received no public recognition, and for decades they could tell no one, not their families, not their neighbors, what they had done in service of their country. The first overflight of the Soviet Union took place on July 4, 1956. The date was deliberate: America's Independence Day. A statement, even if the world would not know it for decades. The U-2 crossed into Soviet airspace over East Germany, flew over Leningrad, photographed Moscow, and returned safely. The photographs were extraordinary. Military installations, bomber fleets, missile testing facilities, all captured in crisp, unprecedented detail from nearly 14 miles in the sky. Eisenhower was elated. But then something unexpected happened. The Soviets noticed. Soviet radar had tracked the U-2 on its very first mission. They watched it fly over their most sensitive territory and disappear. They could not shoot it down. They could not intercept it. But they knew it was there, and they were furious. The Soviet government sent a formal diplomatic protest, but here is the critical detail. The protest was delivered in secret, through back channels. Because publicly admitting that an American aircraft had penetrated their airspace and they had been powerless to stop it, that was a humiliation they could not afford.
And so both sides played a strange game. The Soviets knew. The Americans knew. The Soviets knew. But neither side acknowledged it publicly. The flights continued. Over the next 4 years, U-2 aircraft flew dozens of missions over the Soviet Union. They photographed submarine pens, nuclear weapons facilities, missile launch sites, and airfields. The intelligence gathered was so valuable that it fundamentally reshaped America's understanding of Soviet military capability. One of the most significant findings, the so-called bomber gap, the widespread belief that the Soviets had far more strategic bombers than the United States, was largely a myth. The U-2 photographs proved it. The program was working beyond anyone's expectations, but the clock was ticking. May 1st, 1960. CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers takes off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in a U-2 aircraft. His mission: fly deep into Soviet airspace, photograph key military installations, and land at a NATO base in Bodo, Norway. It is a mission he has flown before. The program has been running for 4 years without a single loss over Soviet territory. But the Soviets have been getting better. Their surface-to-air missile technology has been improving steadily. And on this morning, as Powers crosses over the city of Sverdlovsk in the Ural Mountains, a Soviet SA-2 missile battery locks onto his aircraft. The missile detonates near the U-2. The aircraft comes apart at altitude. Powers ejects. He survives, and the world is about to change. Back in Washington, the US government activates its denial protocol. The official story: a NASA weather research plane has gone missing after its pilot reported oxygen problems near the Turkish border. It was a cover story prepared years in advance, carefully designed to be plausible. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem. The Soviets had not just shot down the plane. They had recovered the wreckage. They had developed the film from the cameras, photographs showing Soviet military installations from above. They had captured Francis Gary Powers alive. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev let the Americans lie for 4 days. Then he went before the Supreme Soviet and laid it all out. The wreckage, the cameras, the film, the pilot. The United States government was caught in a lie, publicly, internationally, and completely. Eisenhower eventually acknowledged the program, becoming the first American president to publicly admit to ordering espionage against another country. The diplomatic fallout was severe. A planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev in Paris collapsed entirely. Powers was convicted in a Soviet court of espionage and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served less than 2 years before being exchanged in 1962 for a Soviet spy captured in the United States in a famous bridge exchange in Berlin that would become the stuff of Cold War legend. The U-2 program did not end with the Powers incident. The aircraft continued to fly over Cuba, over China, over Vietnam, over the Middle East. It provided critical intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when U-2 photographs gave President Kennedy irrefutable evidence of Soviet missiles being placed 90 miles from Florida's coast. But the full story of the program, its origins, its scope, the identities of its pilots, the nature of its intelligence gathering, remained classified for decades. And here is where the title of today's video truly earns its meaning. The United States government did not merely keep the U-2 program secret. It actively, systematically, and repeatedly denied its existence when pressed. Weather research, civilian aviation experiments, technical anomalies. The official cover stories piled up over the years, each one carefully crafted to obscure the truth. The pilots who had flown those missions, men who had risked their lives, who had operated in complete isolation, who had carried the psychological burden of knowing they would be disavowed if captured, were told to maintain their silence indefinitely. Some of them honored that commitment for their entire lives. They came home to families who did not know what they had done. They went to their graves without recognition. It was not until 1998, more than 40 years after the first overflight, that the CIA began formally declassifying the history of the U-2 program and acknowledging the contributions of its pilots. Even then, the full operational record took years more to emerge. In 2013, in response to a Freedom of Information Act request, the CIA officially acknowledged the existence of Area 51, the classified test site in Nevada, where the U-2 was developed and where so many of its pilots trained. For decades, that facility had not officially existed.
50 years of denial. Not because the program had failed, but precisely because it had succeeded so spectacularly that its legacy had to be protected at all costs. So what is the legacy of the U-2 program? In purely intelligence terms, it is almost impossible to overstate. The photographs taken by U-2 aircraft fundamentally changed what the United States knew about Soviet military capability. They prevented wars by clarifying actual threats rather than imagined ones. They helped prevent nuclear miscalculations at some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis alone, the intelligence provided by U-2 overflights gave President Kennedy the information he needed to make decisions that may have prevented a nuclear exchange. When you consider that context, that the photographs taken by a single aircraft flying at 70,000 feet may have helped avert the end of civilization, the program's importance is staggering. But the legacy of the U-2 program is not just about intelligence. It is about what governments are capable of, both in terms of extraordinary technical achievement and in terms of extraordinary moral complexity. Because here is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. The U-2 program was illegal under international law. Overflying a sovereign nation's territory without permission is a violation of international airspace norms. The United States government knew this, and it did it anyway, because the intelligence was deemed worth the risk. That is a moral calculus that governments continue to make to this day. The technology has changed. The satellites are now far above the atmosphere. The drones are unmanned. But the fundamental question, how far is a government justified in going to protect its people, remains as alive and as contested as ever. The U-2 itself never retired. It continues to fly for the United States Air Force today, more than 70 years after its first overflight of the Soviet Union. It has been updated, modernized, and re-equipped. But the basic design, Kelly Johnson's genius, still carries intelligence officers into the stratosphere. It is, in many ways, the most successful aircraft in American history. The men who flew those early missions received almost no public recognition for most of their lives. They asked for none. They had volunteered for a mission they knew might end in death or permanent disavowal. They accepted those terms, and they flew anyway. Francis Gary Powers, the pilot shot down in 1960, spent years after his return to the United States having his patriotism questioned by people who did not understand and could not be told the full truth of what he had done. He died in 1977 in a helicopter crash while working as a traffic reporter in Los Angeles. He was 57 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, the Prisoner of War Medal, and the Director of Central Intelligence Award. Better late than never, but late nonetheless. The story of the U-2 program is a story about secrecy and sacrifice, about technological ambition and political necessity, about the impossible demands we sometimes place on the people who serve us,
and the silence we ask them to keep. For 50 years, the United States denied this program existed. The men who lived it never complained. They simply carried the weight in silence. Now, you know. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history that shaped the world we live in. And leave a comment. I want to know what part of this story surprised you the most. I will see you in the next one.